as a starting point, when I was at Morgan Stanley in the late 90s, one of the, Mary alluded to the Apples to Apples projects. The first one I worked on was on the auto industry. So this was in 97. And the analyst at the time, Steve Gursky, was by far the number one ranked analyst on the street. He truly understood those businesses. At some stage, he became the vice chairman of GM. But what I learned in that process, and this is in 97, 98, was GM was bankrupt. Okay, unless they could solve the problem of their employees and all the promises that had been made to them. So I started thinking about, is there a way that we could help them solve the problem without necessarily just having to pay out all this cash and essentially go bankrupt? There was no solution other than that, frankly, for them. Through a series of circumstances, Richard Foster and I, Richard was an MD at Morgan Stanley who had been in a consulting business. I think it was Bain, is that? Booz. He was at Booz where he'd been working in the financial services sector. The head of M&A or investment banking had asked him to come and work with him in Morgan Stanley rather than as a consultant to Morgan Stanley. And Richard is probably the most thoughtful person I've ever met on the financial services industry. And he has a PhD and he's involved in Cambridge as a trustee and so on. So we started working on this problem, thinking about solving sort of the corporate issue, but starting with individuals. And we started looking at this from a retail individual point of view. Sort of simultaneously with that, Dick and I had been working on a number of things together, as I alluded to. And around that same time, we were part of a project team that was looking with the top 100 pension funds, or actually the CIOs of the top 100 defined benefit pension plans in the US. Also with the person who was the economist at Goldman Sachs at the time, who's was the head of the Federal Reserve in New York until recently. And, say again?
He's still there, he's leaving.
Oh, he's leaving in June. So he's the head of the Federal Reserve. But we were looking at it from a corporate and then at the state and federal level as well. And the reason why, and I should thank Peter and the organizers for letting me do this, or letting us do this. Particularly, I think Ryan, when he first heard it, he said, that's great, because this is an adventure. But what's really interesting is it crystallizes the difficulty of taking essentially from an individual through corporations to governments in an area that is very real to all of us. And we decided to do this at the end, partly because we knew you'd be a bit exhausted and overwhelmed, and partly because if we've done our job properly, you are going to need a drink when we are done. Okay. So with that, the way we're going to do this is Richard and I built an application with a computer gaming company for the retail business. Okay. And part of that sort of process, he's going to lead us through, and which is where we're going to use some of these questions. And then I'm going to interfere all the time. Dick may or may not interfere all the time, but I'm going to get to the sort of corporate side, and Dick will deal more with the government side. And please, we're going to probably run out of time, but we're happy if you want to interject and ask questions and work with us, okay? Dr. Foster.
Okay, so that's pretty good. We assume the profile was someone who was in their late 30s. That kind of matches the audience. If you're not in that group, you'd have a different picture. So let's move on.
Just 1 sec. I want to show you how this is going to work if we choose to do it that way. So if this is the profile we're looking at, and we click on that, we can see who all of you are, and we have a picture. But more importantly, because I'm going to do this I'll undo it just now, but I'm just going to, by doing that, when we look at the next one, we will condition it just on this group of people. Okay, so one of the things for those of us who teach is that actually you can do either before or after. You can see both the potentially the lack of Bayesian reasoning that people have, but also the inconsistencies in answers through time. So maybe I'll just unplug it, and I won't just yet. I'll take you back, Richard, and then.
Okay, thanks. So we have here a mixture of macro. So what happens to your future income depends on a whole bunch of things about the economy, depends on a whole bunch of things about how employment is going to change, what are the returns to labor relative to returns to capital, what happens to AI, how does that restructure industries. Over that period of time, a whole bunch of things. A set of micro things about things like portfolio construction, a set of behavioral finance things about risk aversion. So in here, there is a mixture of assumptions about everything we've been talking about today. Okay, so let's think about income for the moment. So as most of you are academics, this is a picture you'll be very familiar with, which is the rising cost of annual tuition and fees in constant dollars from 87, 88 onwards. As you see, a relentless rise, and a relentless rise along with healthcare that is significantly higher than the real rise in household median income, which says at some point you're going to start to squeeze the ability of households to continue to pay for both healthcare and education.
So before I show you the answer to this, those of you who are not from the United States, and even those of you here, if you look at how many, we talked about North Carolina, they were all on strike, the teachers were all on strike this last, I think 2 days ago. We have had strikes all the way through. Why? Because governments are not funding education in the way that they were doing before. Okay. So the answer to the next question is, this is just for the 35 to 50-year-olds. This is telling you that only 8 of you of all the submissions, and there are not that many submissions, think that you have more than a 50% chance. Several of you think that you're guaranteed for this. I'm just going to unplug this if I can. And that's everybody, okay, who responded. Okay, so this tells you that the vast majority of you believe that there's more than a 50% chance that you're going to have an equivalent job, potentially as a professor, at least the same or greater income going forward.
And that's interesting. So if we look at the next slide, we see that education is an important driver of productivity in the economy, and therefore is important to government to invest in education. But actually government is, at both the federal and the state level, is reducing the proportion of funding that it's providing to education. And it's down from 69% of educational revenues in 2004-05 to 58% in 14-15. And we've seen the squeeze on the household. So if you ask the question, well, who is going to pay for education? And how do you square that circle? The answer may well be it's you guys in the room. The pressure will come on the tenure and the tenured track. And you can see the fall in the numbers there from 75 to 2005. So 29% of those in educational establishments were tenured in 75. It's now 21%. If you look at the tenured track, it's a much bigger fall from 16% in 75 to 8% in 2015. So, and a corresponding growth in part-time teachers, academics, researchers.
Okay, so I want to, as I said, I'm going to interfere all the time because this is something I've been trying to get people to think about for a long time. If you take that trend in increasing fees and you realize that 2/3 of that has been funded by government, basically, and this will come back when we look later on the thing, and then you say, well, the balance, and it's gone from 7 for public 4-year institutions, this is not including graduate school, which is even more expensive, has gone up significantly. And then you realize that a lot of that is coming from loans. And then you go to, well, there's a squeeze happening at universities. How are they paying for it? The answer that this is telling you is go to part-time. Reduce the number of tenure-track faculty, particularly tenured faculty, which is essentially what this is sort of telling you. So that's a combination of a picture that raises some interesting questions, especially given what you responded before.
Okay, so let's talk about a couple of lifestyle things. An obvious thing to pick on is at what age do you... Sorry?
Whoops, sorry.
We're both controlling this. At what age do you expect to stop working? Do we have the answer to that one?
We do.
So...
Dan Davies thinks he's before 60.
Okay.
It wasn't the guy from Goldman Sachs.
These are all the people who think never, just as a matter of interest.
So now let's compare that to the distribution of what's happening at the moment. We can go back. Okay, so there are multiple definitions of retirement, and the definition of retirement is changing over time. But here we're talking about the age of stopping working, stopping full-time work. And this is comparing 2008 workers, people still in employment, with 2018 retirees, people who have retired, the age at which they retired, the age at which workers think they might retire. And actually they are... The distribution you had was closer, I think, to the retirees than it was to 2018 workers. In other words, the 2018 workers in general are saying, I'm getting worried. So the biggest group, 31%, is saying, I'm getting worried, I'm going to have to work well beyond 70, maybe even never retire. The concept of retirement is a kind of boomer generation concept that may no longer apply. And you can see the shift between those two groups as well.
But there's a problem with that last one, because of that 31%, probably only 7% are going to survive long enough to...
That's a great segue, which we'll come on to in just a moment. Also, the concept of what retirement means. So for people who have retired, retirement tends to mean I've stopped working, I'm going fishing, whatever it is I'm doing. For workers, 3/4 of them are saying, well, I'm going to have to carry on doing something. I'm going to need to earn something because with a DC pension, I'm not going to have enough money to live the life that I want to live. So that is changing the definition of how I think about retirement. This comes on to the issue of longevity. And actually, longevity is an interesting area. So medical science is evolving quite rapidly. And longevity has been going out, except for the last couple of years. We'll come to that. There's also the question of healthy life. And longevity has been growing marginally faster than healthy life expectancy. And there's now a significant gap between them. So let's just look at the answers to those questions. Okay.
Okay, so can I just do one
Yeah.
thing before I do healthy? So if we take this, even this group actually, I wonder if I can pin both. Oh, sorry. I'm trying to be too fancy at this point in time. But if you take that group, and then you go to the next one, okay, that tells you that the people who think they're going to retire, was it between 60 and 65, are expecting to live, or most of you are expecting to live certainly more than 10 years. Some of you in the 20 to 30 range. Just keep that in mind as we keep going.
Okay. Can we go back?
Yeah, this is the this is the healthy life. That's what you wanted?
Yes, so we got them both. So bear those pictures in mind, and then let's move back to the slide if we can.
Okay, but just so that you're all clear. This is when you expect to die, but what this is telling you is that your health is going to be constraining generally earlier than that.
Yes,
Okay?
exactly.
So I just want to make sure everybody got that.
So this is what happens to longevity at birth on the left-hand side. And it's been going up pretty consistently across the whole of the West for quite a long period of time. What's interesting is the last couple of years in the West. The last couple of years has turned down. And actuaries aren't really quite sure, and it's pretty consistent across countries, and actuaries really aren't quite sure why that is the case. The first year it happened, they thought it was a blip. It had then happened the second year, and they're really not quite sure why, and they're a little panicked about it within insurance companies. On the right-hand side, to calibrate your responses, a man who is at present 65 can expect to live to be 84. A woman turning 65 today can expect to live to be getting on for 87. And there's quite a big tail on this. So there is, as you know, there are an increasing number of people living into their 90s, increasing number of people living to be over 100. And it comes back to one of Dick's comments this morning, is longevity a good thing? Well, it's nice to live a long time. In terms of household finances, it's quite an interesting challenge. Will health keep pace with life? Trevor's going to do some more magic here and show you some data.
So we didn't know this was going to happen at the time that we were putting this together, but the BBC had this application, so you can go to the site if you want, and you can fill in and see exactly these issues. So we were going to put in, what, 38, Richard?
Yeah, 38.
So we put 38, and we put women, and you show the results. It shows you that a woman aged 35 to 39 in your country will on average live another 47 years. And a man, we will die sooner. But that tells you how much of that remaining life will be healthy. Of course, these are averages, and we don't like averages, but
But translating that back, that's kind of 9 years. I mean, that's quite a long time that you would be relatively unhealthy or impaired in terms of what you're doing towards the end of your life. And that gap is probably growing over time.
do you want to show men?
Yeah, why not?
Okay, so the life expectancy is obviously the same as before, but now the healthy life is different. Now, it's a shorter period, but the percentage is up. But it's interesting that the dynamic of healthy and unhealthy, and we don't know where the data comes from, frankly, but it does actually show. And if you go across the world, one of the interesting things is if you put in my age and you put in a 30-year-old, they actually have a shorter life expectancy. Okay, and that's because of the opioid crisis at the moment. You can also look by state, and where you located, at least in the United States, you can see if it's going to make a difference. Go ahead, Richard.
So if you put increasing longevity together with low birth rates, a worldwide trend towards being much less encouraging about immigration, you start to get to a point where, of course, you have an aging population, and the question is, well, how do I pay for the social security and social care that implies? And together with that, as we saw earlier, retiree healthcare costs have been going up pretty steeply. The out-of-pocket costs for the retiree are going up pretty steeply. So that's on average, but as we talked about at some point this morning, the issue is less the average than the shocks. And if you look at how medical technology is moving on, we're at the cusp of some really quite major breakthroughs, I think, in terms of genetic engineering, biomaterials, stem cell treatments and so on, many of these certainly initially will be very expensive. And there's an interesting question about who's going to pay for that. An interesting question actually about whether you would pay for that for yourself, depending on the size of the bill. And I think we have...
Yeah, we're going to come to that. Just before you do that, just go back a sec. So I just want to make sure you understand, when you saw that number, 750,000, you probably thought it was too high. This was in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago. Again, we didn't anticipate it was going to be published. But this was a case of a 62-year-old man who ended up having these treatments which collectively cost $1 million. Okay? And I don't know how much he had to pay for it, but it'll fit in with what we're going to say later in terms of, well, what if you have to pay for it, or a bulk of it for yourself? So that's why we asked this series, the next series of questions. You want me to speak?
So, yeah, please do.
Okay, so again, if we have the time, I'll go back and you're interested, I'll condition it based on your age. But what this says is most of you are willing to do it. And one of the, we'll then look at let's go to when you're 70, which is the next one. Now it's a little bit different, okay? And one of the interesting questions is, when we talk about things like pensions and consumption, everyone can change. When you're talking about dying and health, most people are irrational, at least economically irrational. Emotionally, they are very concerned, obviously. And this applies whether it's you, and now this one's going to be particularly interesting. This is now your grandchild. Okay. I'm not going to go and see who's no or not sure. I'll look at that, but
it's that Goldman guy again. Okay. So, a set of assumptions built in about in that original forecast about longevity, about healthcare, about your willingness to pay for it. The last one I'll talk about is the long-term asset returns. This is the long-term asset returns for developed market equities from 1900 to 2018 first quarter. And it's actually it's a surprisingly consistent picture over more than 100 years of an average return of 8.4% per annum nominal and relatively consistent. But of course, it hides what matters in financial planning is actually not the consistency of the asset returns, but the shocks. And if you look at the shocks, and in particular, it's the timing of shocks relative to when you want to do something that you care about. So if the market falls, if you take the 2008 banking crash there, if the market falls 38% in the USA the year you're retiring, you are completely screwed because you've started drawing down on your money. That money is down 38%, and you can never rebuild that without fundamentally rethinking what you're doing. So the issue here is actually those shocks are getting slightly more frequent over time, but it's the shock, it's not the average return that shapes what you can do and what you can't do. So if we take all of that together and think about the range, the distribution of answers you've given us about what do you think, and you model out stochastically what could happen to you, if you think of that first picture we started of the financial plan that says, here's a line, and by the way, you might run out of money 5 years from now. If you model that out, and this is from the model that Trevor and I built at Morgan Stanley, and you model out that uncertainty, you get a very different kind of picture, and you ask very different questions about it. So this is a three-dimensional picture. On the left-hand side, going out to the left, is a measure of wealth. This is actually looking at available net worth, so your total net worth minus the property that you live in. You have time on the axis going out to the right, and this is a probability density function, so the height of the data point is a function of the likelihood of you having that amount of money at that point in time. The lollipops are goals, so they wanted to put their 2 kids through university, the first 2 lollipops, and the third lollipop is the probability of them being able to afford to retire. Now, we've introduced a lot of stochastics and a lot of shocks and a lot of things like instance of healthcare, instance of needing long-term care, probably of living a long time. And that has reduced your ability to retire from it looked reasonably good in the first picture to a 1/3 probability of funding it in this picture. But, and this is actually a relatively simple representation of the stochastics. Not everything is stochastic there, and they're all independently modeled. Then we haven't picked up the interconnections that we've talked a lot about today. But when you look out from that, you think very differently about what am I going to do here? And you start to think in terms of, it's actually not about cash flow forecasting. I can't forecast 50 years in advance how much money I'm going to have. It's actually about how do I manage the risks around the things that I really care about. So I have this big red tail here. Red means bad, I've run out of money. You're forced to look at that and say, what is causing that? And how do I manage it? How do I get rid of that red tail? So I'm asking different questions, and I'm thinking about financial planning very differently. So I'm starting to think about outcomes. So what do I really care about, as opposed to portfolio volatility? So the financial planning industry focuses on, if my portfolio fell 10%, how do I feel about it? You must be moderately conservative or some such label. Actually, what people really care about is there's some things I really want to do. In this case, I really want to put my 2 kids through university. If I fail to do that, I will feel like I've failed as a father. And therefore, I want to de-risk those critical outcomes. I want to understand what could possibly threaten that happening and take out as much of that risk as I possibly can. When you have a picture like that, you start to think about conditional decision-making. So path-dependent decisions that says, well, if I'm going out 10 years and I'm on a good part of that surface, I may start to do different things. If I'm on a bad part of that surface, then I may adapt my behavior, I may adapt what I'm doing, I may change my job, I may do a whole bunch of things in order to deal with that. There are some things that I might like to do that are kind of more nice to have. In that case, I may want to kind of play with this thing and see what I can do. But in general, people don't play with things that are really important to them. So I want to nail down the things that are really important to me. And other things I may play with, well, I might take a bit more risk here, I might invest over here, providing it doesn't risk the things that I really care about. And this is essentially about making trade-offs. And those trade-offs are both planned and unplanned, which is why we ask you the question about if your grandchild were ill, would you pay for the treatment? That would be an unplanned shock. And the question is, how do I make those trade-offs? To what extent can I think about it beforehand? To what extent do I have to adapt as I go through that, because that suddenly becomes really important to me? And in that context, you start to get into questions about what should I as a household be responsible for, and what should I be held accountable for? What can I manage? And that may mean, taking out insurance policies. It may mean a whole bunch of things. What am I expecting my employers to be able to do for me, because they can manage some of these risks better than me? And what do I need from government? So you're starting to get into a way of thinking about integration between the household, the firm, the macro, less in terms of data aggregation, clearly that's important, but much more in terms of what is the nature of the covenant between us. And it's clearly going to change because it's unaffordable as it stands at the moment. How does that covenant change in a way that still works for most households? So as we go up a level to companies and governments, I'm about to hand over to Trevor and Dick.
Okay. So one of the lessons, thanks. One of the lessons that Richard and I learned, actually, Richard, if you're using that, I'll take that. So one of the lessons we learned, we thought that modeling individuals would be easier than modeling corporations. We were very wrong. Okay? But as I said to you, this started with looking at GM, actually. And Dick and I did this as well, and then I did it with with a pension specialist. And we visited a lot of companies trying to help them think about de-risking their own defined benefit pension plans. So this question that we pose to you, just so you understand the question, is you're a CFO of a large public company, your DB plan is heavily overfunded, and your expected return is significantly above your discount rate. Okay, so a banker comes in and says, we can de-risk this for you, but it's going to be at a much lower discount rate, and you won't have a problem going forward, but you're going to lose in terms of that return as well. So your EPS is going to be affected. Would you defease? And your answer was the majority, although not a huge majority, said no. And some of you said yes. A significant number said yes. At that time, we did not find one CFO that was willing to do it. Okay? And in fact, even when they understood it, they chose not to do it. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in a second. So the question that it poses is, where are we today, and sort of how did we get here? So if you look at this particular graph, what you see is this is the top 100 pension funds, the largest US private pension plans. You'll see they had surplus in the time of the internet bubble, and they had surplus again going into 2007. Many companies, I'll show you two in specifically in a second, were much higher than that. Okay, and then they could have learned a lesson here. This is sort of when Dick and I were doing that study with SEBA, and we were told at that time it's a 1 in 100-year tsunami, a black swan, basically. Okay, and of course that was, unfortunately for them, not true. So why did they fall into this trap? One was, I'm going to put this down, it's easier. One was, we okay if I use this? Okay. Was the lack of understanding of the issues and the fact that they could not relate sort of the macro and the micro together. That was one. Someone mentioned that trusting accountants, I think it was Dan, and actuaries were the sort of the two people trusted. The actuaries got it all wrong. Okay? And in fact, I remember a CFO of a large UK bank or international bank in the UK telling me that he was a trustee in one of their pension funds, and the actuary came in and said, well, if we use the right economics, it's A, which is a significant deficit. If we change the assumptions a little bit, it's B, which is a little bit, and if it's C, you break even. Which one do you want? But the assumptions they used were also misstated, as you'll see in a second. They over-relied on statistics, things we talked about before, the historical data series that they were using, and they did not focus on asset liability management. When we presented to this group of 100 CIOs, the actuary stood up and said, you know, it probably is time that we talk to each other. Because he'd only been focusing, or they'd been focusing on the liability side without thinking about it as an asset liability matching. In the United States, we had significantly misguided tax policy, and I would argue regulatory rules through ERISA as well. But this is the real one, which, again, Ryan and I spoke about as to one of the reasons we wanted to do this. The accounting rule we had that has only just been, to some extent, substituted this year is what the CIO of Verizon called the cocaine of the CFO. Okay, that was the accounting rule, which I'll explain to you in a second, for those of you who don't know it. And someone asked earlier about efficient markets. When we were doing this, the fixed income analyst, who was actually the top analyst on the street in the auto industry, had not looked at pensions. The airline analyst had, but not the auto analyst. Most of our investing clients had not been paying attention to what was going on in the pensions. And in fact, if you looked at Verizon when it was spun out of if you looked at Lucent when it was spun out of AT&T, more than half their operating income was coming from pension assets, the expected return on their pension assets relative to their discount rate. And no one was treating it the same way. So here, if you look, AT&T 2012 puts $9.5 billion in equity into its pension fund. Okay, and there are others too, including General Motors. And if you look at the questions, this is what I use in my class actually. Did management investors make the right decisions in prior years? We're going to look at that in a second. How easily could these have been prevented? The answer is easily. And could they or you have built this into your forecast? So if you think about how if you teach financial statement analysis or forecasting or in finance, and you think that how you would actually incorporate this, trust me, at that point in time, it was almost impossible to do, especially if you wanted to do a balance sheet as well. A year later, actually a few months later, Verizon is doing the same thing. Then we go to 2015, and AT&T posts pension hit as rates fall and mortality increases. So there are two important things, or three really, to notice here. One is it's a big number. The other is they call it a non-cash hit. Okay, very typical of what people talk about when they talk about pensions as CFOs and investors. This is cash that is going out of the door. There is no question. It's just a question of when it's going out. And the last point at the bottom here is they said that it used updated mortality tables to calculate the liability, which helped push up the number. Why? Because the Society of Actuaries had updated their table in 2014 for the first time since 2000. Even when we were doing the analysis in 2000, Social Security then had been using a table from 1984 before they updated in 2000. If you looked at that longevity graph, and this is true in most countries, it has been going up for a very long time. So the basic assumptions that were embedded in all of these were grossly wrong. And again, I don't think there was an auditor who paid any attention because it did comply with GAAP. So here's AT&T and Verizon in terms of their pension fund surplus or deficit. So 2000 to 2000, this is 180% in 1999. They could have totally defeased this and had extra to give out to their employees. Even in 2001, they had a 20% surplus, even with these mortality assumption issues they could have solved. Okay. They had another opportunity. They had another opportunity just before the crisis. So why don't they do it? It's the cocaine of the CFO. What this does is, the way the accounting worked literally until this year, is that you had the service cost, which was essentially deferred compensation. You had some other little adjustments, but then you had, and changes in actuarial assumptions, but then you had the expected return on plan assets and the interest at the discount rate on the obligation. That gap, which was essentially just risk, was included in operating income. So what GM did in 2003 was they borrowed $19 billion, call it 20, at just over 6%. So they paid $1.2 billion in interest, and they funded their pension plan. And they had an expected return of, I think it was 9% of the time. So that's essentially taking $1.8 billion and adding it to operating income. And the balance, some of the offset was in interest. So what a lot of us like to do is like to look at operating income, or EBIT, or God forbid, EBITDA. And you've just created $2 billion of operating income from fiction. And the irony is, when you talk about regulators, the SEC took to task GM at one point in time because they didn't use a high enough expected return, because the last 3 years they'd earned above that. And in fact, if they hadn't done that, because they did have actually, their timing was wonderful and they got great actual returns, that staved off the bankruptcy by about 4 years. So the issue is, and this is an issue for all countries, most countries, so Dick will talk about this in a second, this is not just a US phenomenon. There are a couple of you here from the Netherlands. The Netherlands is the one country that I'm aware of anyway, where the regulators prevented corporations from having this problem because they always insisted they were 106% funded. Okay? So this graph is from that SEBA report that Dick and I did. And it's very instructive because this is true potentially for you, but especially for corporations and governments. This is a mature plan, which all of them are. So this is the actual cash outflow that's going to happen. It was not a problem when you were being replaced either with active employees, so you're essentially filling up the VAT, or new participants, or if the company's growing, you're adding more people. Okay, so as long as you're replacing the retirees, it's not as much of an issue. That's a pay-as-you-go system, which is essentially what we have in the macro. So now I'm going to hand it over to Dick to talk about some of the macro stuff, and then, again, I'll probably interfere a bit, but then I'll wrap it up and take questions.
Okay.
You want to
Yep.
do it here?
Why don't I do it here? Yep. So Trevor talked about, the fact that this is not just a U.S. problem, and we'll dig into the U.S. A little bit, but what this chart shows is that projected pension expenditure as a share of GDP,
Yeah. Well, this is public expenditure.
This is public expenditure in a variety of countries. Is a very significant part of GDP, and the chart shows projections going out to 2050, and you can assume that these things are probably going to grow over time. Now, some of the projections anticipate that they will grow, but some of them, obviously, the projections are all over the map, and so if you just look at the middle, which shows the OECD 28 countries, you can see that this is a very significant chunk of GDP. And if anything, from my perspective, the tail risk in these things is that they're going to be skewed to the upside rather than to the downside for all the reasons that Trevor and Richard have talked about. Longevity is going to increase, and healthy lives are going to increase, but lives that may not be so healthy are likely to increase, and the pension expenditure is going to be there. So public pensions are, from my standpoint, an even bigger problem than private pensions. After all, think about the fact that many corporations who had DB plans have either frozen them or terminated them. And so if you look back at Trevor's chart, the chart that we had, let me see if I can, this way? No? There we go. It shows current pensioners, and of course the assumption there is that these folks are going to pass away. If you assume that there aren't any new participants, then you flip to the other side of the hill, and things look pretty good, relatively speaking, to when you have a going concern, if you will, pension plan that allows for a growing business and new participants. So freezing is certainly one solution, but that is not an option under current laws in most places for public pensions. So these things are only going to grow. So the question is, who's going to pay? And the answer is people in this room, and taxpayers and future generations. There's just no question. Either the systems change or we will continue to pay more. Now, what's interesting is, if we look at the funding gaps in public pensions, and this is a Milliman study, the funded status of the 100 largest U.S. public pension plans, which are states and localities. So I'm sure you've all been reading the papers about Illinois and Chicago and other states and municipalities. And one thing that's clear from this chart is over the past 4 years, the liabilities have clearly grown faster than the assets. And that's a function of all the things that we've been talking about. So the funding gaps have, by and large, been growing. What you don't know is that the assumptions in public pension plans are far more unrealistic than they are for private pension plans, because pension reform in 2006 that Trevor and I were talking to people a lot about really lowered the assumed returns and raised the discount rates that were used to discount the stream of cash flows from liabilities that constituted the liabilities. That's not true for public pension plans. The assumed returns are too high, and the discount rates are too low. And in fact, there's a Northwestern economist named Josh Raw who estimates that just the pension deficits for states and municipalities is not $1.5 trillion. It's more like $4 trillion. Moreover, this does not include OPEB, other post-employment retirement benefits. Healthcare benefits for state and local employees are by and large completely unfunded. Okay. So now let's look across the country and see where some of these funding ratios represent the biggest problems. I mentioned Illinois, but other states clearly stand out. And what's important here is to look at how many states are at just 50%. So that when you look at the national average, that doesn't tell you where the distress is going to be in all these states that are either dark red or somewhat less lurid in color.
So I need to interrupt again. So those of you who are at state schools and you see that graph and you ask yourself the question, if there's a trade-off, if revenue is limited and there's a trade-off, who's going to get the money? You, the schools, or the pensioners? I don't know what your answer is. I'm just telling you that's what you've got to think about.
So think about this. Trevor just alluded to the fact that in North Carolina, we've seen teacher strikes, and since February, we've had teacher strikes in many parts of the country, Kentucky, Arizona, other parts of the country. These teacher strikes are the result of funding for education having been cut back over the past 10 years. Really, it predated the financial crisis. It started with the pension crisis. When Trevor and I started working on this stuff, we used to think to ourselves, okay, these are funding gaps, but these aren't cash flow problems yet, right? But the problem is that the cash flow problems are starting to come home to roost, and they are having a major impact on other needed public expenditures, and education is one of those things. Okay, who's going to pay for this? Well, taxes are going up. State and local taxes are going up steadily. And that's one vehicle through which they're going to pay. Okay. Again, we said the problem is a global problem. The median age of the population continues to rise. Longevity continues to rise. Trevor's right that I think in the past couple of years we've seen longevity at birth start to decline because of the opioid crisis. But for the portions of the population, those are averages, right? For the portions of the population not affected by the opioid crisis, longevity will continue to increase. Healthcare expenditure will continue to increase. And you can see in this slide how the demographics are changing on a global basis.
So I need to point out something here that affects all of us in the academic world anyway. So many people historically think of China as not having a problem, right? China has a huge demographic issue because of the one-child policy. And if we think they're the ones who are going to come and pay for our schools, I think you've got to think very carefully because they've got the trade-offs too. And if you look at where the population growth, and it's growing a lot over the next essentially 35 years, it's in Pakistan, Indonesia, Africa, all the poor countries, or poorer countries, or less developed countries. Why? Because children are the pension funds of the poorer communities. Are they going to come to our schools?
So then we come to, the classic problem of public debt. The problem of public debt is not that, at some point we have to repay it. The point is that we have to service it. And as we look at just the recent expansion of the federal deficit and the debt, we're now going to approach 100% of GDP for the debt. And debt service, as interest rates start to renormalize in this environment again, will start to represent a larger and larger share of the federal budget. Two economists wrote a long time ago, Neil Wallace and Tom Sargent, some unpleasant monetarist arithmetic. Some of you economists in the room may be familiar with that, but when you start to get debt ratios high enough, and when interest rates start to rise beyond potential growth rates, then you have an unsustainable situation. So, Trevor's represented in this slide as, we're going to owe $82,000. It's the debt service that really I worry about over time, and that our children and our grandchildren will be forced to pay. And that's true at the state and local level as well. So, is that scary enough?
So let me. So when we ask you who's going to pay, remember we're a very, very privileged group. So there was a survey done by Go Banking Rates. I have no idea who they are, but it was reported that 42% of Americans will retire broke. Now, what's interesting is there's different pieces of information. EBRI came out recently and said people are actually ending up having more in their savings during retirement than they thought. But again, that's a subset of a survey. So the question is, someone's going to have to pay for them. And to the extent there's a social contract that Richard was alluding to, this is from the most recent trustees report, which this is from the Peterson Institute. What this says is that Medicare will be exhausted by 2029. And a 12% cut in benefits would affect 80 million beneficiaries. Social Security will be out of money by 2034. So if you look at that 38-year-old, that was the average we were using, you're not getting Medicare, you're not getting Social Security. Okay, unless we change something. So, some takeaways. Part of the reason that we believe we're in this situation is because people are not factoring in uncertainties and thinking about outcomes in a much broader set, in a much broader way. So one of the questions is, it surprises me. Actually, I know I'm a little over time. I just want to show you one thing that comes back to the accounting, because I meant to mention it. I've been involved in trying to get them to change pension accounting in IFRS and US GAAP for years. And they keep asking about discount rates and summaries. And all I say is, just show me this picture. I don't care what the discount rate is if you show me this picture. Because now I know what the expected payments are going to be going forward. And then I can actually get something on the asset side, and I'll be able to do my own ILM. And yes, it comes back to what Dan was saying. We get overwhelmed with data. But that's not a problem today, because today we've got computers that can deal with all of that stuff. So it's about changing how we think about the reporting model to actually do some of that. Assets, the actuaries, the asset managers, corporates and governments, they've done a poor job of measuring this and providing information. And boards don't understand it. And if you actually talk to the people who are involved in this day to day, they're not giving it in a way that we could actually do. And again, how much of us teach this in a way that we can incorporate it into our analyses going forward? And probably the biggest outcome which relates to this whole conference is that it's all about the interconnectedness and the feedback loops between the individual, the government, and the corporations. Somebody's got to pay for this. And if we don't understand how all of these things interact, if there's no money, what happens to a consumption-based society? Okay, and again, this is not just a US phenomenon. This is happening in different paces in places like Japan. They can't grow because they've got no immigration, no birth, aging population. questions. We've got minus a minute for questions. Okay, so we ready for a drink, Peter? Thank you.